Mud sucked at her boots with every step. Della Whitfield ran anyway. The hem of her traveling dress had already soaked through, heavy and dark, slapping against her legs as she pushed past a hitching post and a startled dog. Behind her, church bells were still ringing, not for a wedding now, but for a bride who had disappeared. The train depot sat at the far edge of town, past the feed store, past the saloon where two men stopped mid-sentence to watch her go. She didn't slow down to explain herself. She didn't have an explanation, not one that made sense, even to her. She had a ticket in her coat pocket that read Cheyenne to St. Louis, purchased with money she wasn't sure she'd need. She had a wedding ring, still unworn, wrapped in a handkerchief. And she had a memory she couldn't outrun no matter how fast her boots moved through the mud. A little girl's face, wide brown eyes, a small hand reaching up. "Mama?" Della's chest tightened. She kept running. 15 minutes earlier, she had been standing in front of the church with a bouquet of wildflowers someone had picked for her that morning, someone kind enough to think of it. She had been standing across from a man she had exchanged 11 letters with over 4 months. A man whose handwriting slanted left, whose words were careful and few, who had once written, "I don't have much to offer besides honest work and quiet company, but both are yours if you'll have them." She had liked that letter. She had read it 3 times. Then the church doors opened, and a small girl in a blue dress walked in holding an older woman's hand, and the girl looked at Della with such open, trusting hope that something inside Della simply broke. Nobody had told her about a daughter. That wasn't true exactly. Eli Carver had mentioned a child in his 3rd letter. One line, easy to miss, tucked between a sentence about the ranch and a sentence about the weather. "My daughter Sarah keeps me company most days." Della had read past it without understanding what it meant. A word on paper was not the same as a small hand reaching for hers in front of a church full of strangers. She had looked at that reaching hand and seen her own mother's hand instead. Thin, pale, letting go of hers in a room that had smelled like fever and candle wax. She was 7 years old again. She was standing at a graveside in a dress too big for her, being told that she would learn to manage, that grief was something a person simply carried. She had spent 17 years since then making sure she never had to be responsible for a child's heart the way her aunt had been forced to be responsible for hers, dutifully, without warmth, counting the days until Della was grown enough to be someone else's concern. She was not her aunt, but she was terrified she might become her. So when the girl in the blue dress smiled up at her and asked, in a small, clear voice, "Are you going to be my new mama?" Della had turned, walked back down the aisle, out the doors and into the mud, and she had not stopped since. The depot came into view through the rain, a squat wooden building with a tin roof and a single lantern burning near the ticket window. Smoke rose from the station master's stove. A trunk sat unattended on the platform, waiting for a train that wasn't due for another hour. Della slowed only when she reached the steps. She pressed a hand to her side, catching her breath, and for the first time since she'd fled the church, she let herself feel the shame of what she'd done. She had left a man standing at an altar. She had left a child holding a bouquet meant for someone else. She had traveled 1,100 miles to become somebody's wife, and instead she had become the story this town would tell for years, the bride who ran. She sat down on a bench beneath the tin overhang, pulled her damp coat tighter, and closed her eyes. That was when she heard the horse. Eli Carver did not chase women who ran from him. He had told himself that on the walk from the church to the livery, boots striking hard against the boardwalk, jaw tight enough to ache. A man had his pride. If Della Whitfield had taken one look at his daughter and turned around, that told him something plain and hard about the kind of arrangement they'd have had. Better she ran now than after the ring was on her finger. That was what he told himself. He saddled his horse anyway, not because he intended to drag her back to any altar. He was 31 years old, a widower for going on 2 years, and he had learned the difference between a woman staying because she wanted to and a woman staying because she felt she had no choice. He would never build a marriage on the second kind. But it was November in Wyoming territory, and the sky over the mountains had gone the color of a bruise, and any rancher worth his salt knew what that meant. A storm was coming down off the Laramie Range, and it was coming fast. A woman alone on unfamiliar ground, in weather like that, with no coat suited for it and no notion of how quickly these plains could turn deadly. That wasn't pride talking. That was plain decency. He told himself it was only decency. He rode toward the depot with his collar turned up against the first hard gusts of wind, and he tried very hard not to think about the way Sarah's face had fallen when the bride ran, or the quiet way she'd asked, "Did I do something wrong, Papa?" "No," he'd told her, smoothing her hair. "No, sweetheart, you did nothing at all." He hadn't been able to explain the rest. He didn't understand it himself yet. Della heard hoofbeats slow to a stop outside the depot, and her whole body went rigid. She didn't turn around. She stared straight ahead at the empty tracks, at the rain slanting sideways now under the tin roof, and she waited for the voice she knew she'd hear. "Storm's coming," Eli said. Not "why did you run?" Not "how could you?" Just that, flat, unhurried, like he was commenting on the weather to a stranger at a dry goods counter. "I have a ticket," Della said. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "Train's not due for near an hour. Storm will be here in 20 minutes. He came to stand at the edge of the platform, far enough that she didn't feel crowded, close enough that she had to look at him if she wanted to see his face. Rain had darkened his hat and the shoulders of his coat. These plain storms aren't like what you're used to back east. Ground turns to a river. Wind takes the roof clean off a barn if you're not careful. I've seen men freeze not a half-mile from their own door because they figured they knew better than the sky. Della kept her eyes on the tracks. "I'm sorry about your daughter." Something in his face changed at that. Not anger, something quieter. "She'll be all right. She's tougher than she looks. Takes after her mother that way." The words sat between them, heavy with a grief Della hadn't earned the right to ask about. "I panicked," Della said finally, because the silence had gone on too long, and she owed him at least that much honesty. "I saw her, and I'm not who you think I am, Mr. Carver. I'm not someone who knows how to be a mother. I never learned. My own mother died when I was 7, and the woman who raised me made sure I understood that raising a child was a burden, not a joy. I came out here because I was tired of being a burden to her, and I nearly made your daughter into mine." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Rain drummed against the tin roof, steady and hard now, the wind starting to howl low through the boards of the depot. "I didn't ask you to be her mother," he said finally. "Not yet. Not today. I asked you to marry a man you'd written letters to for 4 months, and see if maybe there was something worth building. Sarah's my responsibility. She's always going to be my responsibility, first and foremost. Anything you offered her beyond that, that was always going to be your choice, in your own time. Nobody was going to hand her to you at the altar and call it done." Della finally turned to look at him. Rain had soaked through his collar. His eyes, she noticed for the first time since the church, were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "Then why did you come after me?" she asked. "If you're not asking me to stay?" Eli held her gaze for a moment before he answered. "Because a storm's coming," he said, "and whatever happens between us after tonight, married or not, staying or going, I wasn't raised to let a person face something like that alone." The wind screamed suddenly through the gap beneath the depot doors, and somewhere behind them, in the rising dark, the first crack of thunder rolled down off the mountains like the sky itself had made a decision neither of them had asked for. Della looked past Eli's shoulder at the black clouds swallowing the last gray light of afternoon, and understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that there would be no train tonight. There would be no going back to St. Louis. Not for hours. Maybe not until morning, which meant she had only one choice left standing in front of her. The same choice she'd run from an hour before, except now the storm had taken the running away from her entirely. "Mr. Carver," she said, and her voice shook only a little. "What happens now?" He held out his hand. "Now," he said, "we get you somewhere safe. The rest we can talk about after." She looked at his open hand, weathered, steady, asking nothing of her but trust for the length of a storm. And for the first time since she'd left the church, Della Whitfield did not run. She took his hand. The wind had teeth in it now, cold enough to bite through wool, and Eli didn't waste time on words. He led the horse by the reins with one hand and kept Della close with the other, cutting a path down the muddy street toward a two-story house with lamplight glowing gold in every window. The only building in town that looked like it was expecting company. A hand-painted sign swung wildly above the porch. "Ruth's boarding house. My sister-in-law's place," Eli said, raising his voice over the wind. "Sarah's there already. Ruth took her when things went sideways at the church." Della's stomach dropped at the thought of facing the little girl again, but there was no time to argue. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and the first hard pellets of hail began hammering the tin roofs up and down the street. Eli half pulled her up the porch steps just as the door swung open. The woman who stood in the doorway was tall, sharp-featured, somewhere near 40, with graying hair pulled back, so tightly it looked like it might hurt. Her eyes went from Eli to Della and stayed there, cool and assessing, the way a person looks at a debt they're not sure will be repaid. "Get inside before you both catch your death," Ruth said. It wasn't warm. It wasn't unkind either. It was simply practical. The voice of a woman who had spent her life managing crises before they became disasters. Inside, the boarding house smelled of wood smoke and baking bread, a startling contrast to the violence building outside. A fire cracked in the front room hearth, and curled up on a quilt beside it, half asleep with her thumb near her mouth, was Sarah. She sat up when she saw them, and for one unbearable second, Della thought the girl might cry, or worse, might look at her with the same fear a burned hand learns for fire. Instead, Sarah's whole face opened up like a window catching morning light. "You came back," she said. Della knelt slowly, mud still drying stiff on the hem of her dress. "I did. Papa said maybe you got lost," Sarah said, matter of fact, the way small children delivered devastating truths without meaning to. "I told him grown-ups don't get lost. I said maybe you got scared instead." "Were you scared?" Behind her, Della heard Ruth go very still. There was no good way to answer a 5-year-old's honesty with a lie, and Della found, to her own surprise, that she didn't want to. "Yes," Della said quietly. "I was scared." Sarah considered this with the solemn seriousness only children seem capable of. "I get scared of thunder," she offered, as if trading one secret for another. "Mama used to say thunder was just the sky clearing its throat before it talks. I still don't like it, though." "Mama," past tense, said so easily, so often repeated it had worn smooth, like a stone handled every day for years. Della glanced up and caught Eli's face, a flicker of old grief crossing it, gone as quickly as it came, the practiced composure of a man who had learned to carry sorrow without setting it down in front of his daughter. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, and Sarah flinched and pressed herself against Della's knee without seeming to decide to do it at all. It was instinct, the same instinct that made small creatures seek warmth in a storm, and Della, without deciding to either, put her arm around the girl's shoulders. Nobody in the room said anything about it, but Ruth's eyes had not moved from the two of them since the thunder cracked. Eli went back out into the wind 20 minutes later to see to the horses, insisting the animals needed settling before the worst of it arrived, waving off Ruth's protest that he'd catch his death doing it. The door banged shut behind him, and the house seemed to exhale in his absence. as if some tension it had been holding could finally loosen now that only women and a child remained. Ruth set a cup of tea in front of Della without being asked and sat down across the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around her own cup, studying her the way a buyer studies a horse she isn't sure she trusts. "You want to tell me why you ran?" Ruth said. Not a question. Della wrapped her fingers around the warm cup. In the front room, Sarah hummed softly to herself, arranging wooden blocks by the fire, out of earshot but close enough that Della kept her voice low. "I saw your niece," Della said, "and I thought of my own mother. She died when I was young. The woman who raised me after made sure I understood that a child is a weight a person carries, not a gift. I panicked. I thought, I can't do that to her. I can't be someone who carries her out of duty and calls it love." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, turning her cup slowly on its saucer. "My sister was the finest woman I ever knew," she said finally. "Anne, Eli's wife. She had a laugh you could hear clear across the north pasture, and she loved that girl in there so much it near broke every rule of sense a person's supposed to have." Ruth's jaw tightened. She died bringing a second child into this world. The baby didn't make it either. Sarah was 3. She still asks, sometimes, if her mother's coming back from town. Della's throat closed. "I'm sorry. I'm not telling you this so you'll pity us," Ruth said sharply. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand what you're standing in the middle of before you decide whether to run again. That girl has already buried one mother. If you walk into her life and let her love you, and then you leave, that's not the same as a stranger leaving. That's a second grave she has to carry, except this one she'll blame herself for, the way children always do." Ruth's eyes were hard, but not cruel. "So I'll ask you plainly, Miss Whitfield, are you the running kind? Because if you are, best you get on that train the moment the tracks are clear, and never come back through this town again. It would be kinder." The words landed like a slap, and Della absorbed them because she knew, somewhere beneath the sting, that they were fair. She thought of the church, of the mud, of Sarah's small reaching hand, and the wide, unguarded hope in her eyes. Hope Della had turned and walked away from without a second thought. "I don't know what kind I am," Della admitted. "I only know that when I sat with her just now, and she was afraid of the thunder, I wasn't thinking about myself at all. I was only thinking about her." Ruth studied her for a long moment, something in her expression shifting, softening by a single degree. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of a question she hadn't expected to be asking. "That's something at least," she said quietly. The storm broke fully an hour past dark, and it broke hard. Hail gave way to driving rain, and the wind found every loose shutter and rattling pane in the house and worked at them without mercy. Sarah had fallen asleep on the front room quilt despite it all, exhausted past fear, one small fist curled near her cheek. Della sat beside her, unwilling to move, listening to the storm claw at the world outside. That was when they heard it, a groan of splitting wood from the direction of the barn, followed by a crack of lightning so close the whole house lit white for half a second, and then Eli's voice, distant and urgent, shouting for Ruth through the wind. Ruth was at the window in an instant, face going pale. "The stable roof," she said. "Lightning must have hit near the hayloft. He's got 4 horses in there, and mine besides." She was already reaching for her coat. "Watch the girl. I have to help him get them out before that whole roof comes down." "I'm coming too," Della said, standing so fast the tea nearly spilled. "You'll freeze out there. And you don't know the property," Ruth said, already moving toward the door. "Stay with Sarah. If she wakes and neither of us is here, it'll frighten her worse than the storm." The door slammed behind her before Della could argue further. And then Della was alone with a sleeping child and the sound of the wind trying to tear the house apart at its seams. She moved to the window and pressed her palm against the cold glass, straining to see anything through the sheeting rain. Somewhere out there in the dark, past the reach of the porch lantern, orange light flickered against black clouds. Fire, she realized with a jolt of fear. Fire from the lightning strike, fighting for its life against the rain. Two figures moved through that flickering light, small and frantic, dragging something. An animal, she thought, a horse fighting its own panic, toward the safety of the open pasture. Then the wind gusted hard enough to rattle the whole house. The lantern light in the yard guttered and vanished, and Della lost sight of them entirely. She stood at the window with her heart hammering, one hand pressed to the cold glass, watching the black shape of the barn against the churning sky, waiting for a light, a shout, anything to tell her that the two people who had gone out into that storm were still standing. The dark gave her nothing back. A light broke through the dark, small at first, swinging wildly with each step, then growing steadier as it crossed the yard. Della pressed closer to the glass, and her breath caught when she made out two shapes behind it. Ruth in front, soaked through and stumbling with exhaustion, and behind her Eli, leading 4 horses on a line, all of them slick and wild-eyed but alive. Della was at the door before she decided to move, throwing it open into the last dying gusts of the storm. "They're all right," Ruth called over the wind, voice hoarse. "Roof's gone on the north side, but we got every horse out before the fire caught the loft proper. Rain did the rest of our work for us." Eli came up the porch steps last, favoring his left arm, a long scrape along his forearm where a falling beam had caught him, dark with soot and blood both. He looked wrung out in a way that went past the body, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent everything he had and would have spent more if the night had asked for it. "You're hurt," Della said. "I've had worse from a temperamental gelding," Eli said, but he let her take his arm anyway, let her lead him to a chair near the fire while Ruth went to see to the horses in the shed out back, muttering something about hot mash and dry blankets. Della found a basin, clean water, a strip of linen from Ruth's mending basket. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with careful hands, and Eli watched her face rather than his own arm, the way a person watches something they're trying to understand. "You didn't have to stay in there worrying," he said finally. "You could have bolted the door and told yourself it wasn't your fight to lose sleep over." "I know," Della said, tying off the bandage. "I stood at that window anyway." "Why?" She considered the question honestly before she answered it, the way she hadn't let herself do at the church that morning. "Because somewhere between running from your daughter and sitting with her through the thunder," she said, "I stopped being able to imagine walking away and not thinking about the two of you every day for the rest of my life. That frightens me more than the storm did." Eli was quiet for a moment, firelight moving over the tired lines of his face. "And used to say the scariest thing a person can do is let themselves be needed by somebody," he said. "Not loved. Loved is easy to walk away from if you decide to. Needed is different. Needed means somebody's whole day bends around whether you come home." He looked toward the front room, where Sarah's small shape still lay curled on the quilt, oblivious to how close the night had come to changing everything. "I haven't let myself be needed by anybody since I buried her. Not really. I told myself I was protecting Sarah. Truth is, I was protecting myself. And now?" Della asked quietly. "Now I've got a scraped arm, a half-burned barn, and a woman who stood at my sister-in-law's window all night worrying whether I'd make it back," Eli said, and something almost like a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, the first she'd seen from him since the church. "Seems like being needed found me anyway." Sarah woke near midnight, not from the thunder that had finally rolled east, taking its violence with it, but from some instinct children have for knowing when the shape of a house has changed. She found them both by the fire, Eli's arm freshly bandaged, Della beside him with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, and she didn't ask why the wedding hadn't happened, or where the day had gone, or any of the questions a more guarded child might have needed answered. She only climbed up onto the space between them, settled herself like she'd done it 100 times before, and said, around a yawn, "Is the storm gone?" "It's gone," Eli said, smoothing her hair back from her face. "Good," Sarah said. Then, to Della, with the same unguarded directness she'd carried since the church steps, "Are you staying now?" Della looked at the girl's sleepy, trusting face, and then at Eli, who was watching her with no expectation in his eyes at all. Only the quiet patience of a man who had already decided he would accept whatever answer came and build a life around it either way. That, more than anything else in the long, storm-torn day, was what finally settled something in Della's chest that had been unsettled since she was 7 years old, standing at a graveside in a dress too big for her. Nobody had ever given her the room to choose before. They had only ever told her what she owed. "Yes," Della said, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the word came without fear attached to it at all. "I'm staying." Sarah smiled the way only a half-asleep child can, completely, without calculation, and within minutes had drifted back to sleep between them, one small hand resting on Della's sleeve like she meant to make sure Della couldn't slip away again in the night. Della didn't move for a long while after that. She simply sat there, in the firelight, being held in place by the weight of a sleeping child's trust, and understood that this, not the letters, not the church, not the ring still wrapped in her handkerchief, was the true beginning of everything. The storm had scoured the sky, clean by morning. Della woke to pale gold light coming through Ruth's kitchen window, the world outside gone soft and strange with the season's first snowfall, a thin dusting over the mud and wreckage, turning even the storm's damage into something briefly, quietly beautiful. Ruth had already been up for an hour, moving between the stove and the window with the brisk efficiency of a woman putting a household back in order. When Della came down, Ruth studied her for a moment, really studied her, the way she hadn't the night before, and something in her expression had changed since the storm. "There's a justice of the peace 2 doors down," Ruth said, not quite meeting Della's eyes as she set a plate down harder than it needed. "Man's got nothing better to do most mornings than sit by his own stove. If a person wanted to be married quiet-like, without the whole town standing around watching, today would suit that purpose better than most." It wasn't an apology. Ruth didn't seem the type to offer one outright. But it was, Della understood, as close as the woman was likely to come to saying she'd been wrong to doubt her, and an offering, in its own guarded way, of something that mattered a great deal more than words. They were married an hour past sunrise in the front room of the Justice of the Peace's small house, with frost still silvering the window glass, and nothing grander for witnesses than Ruth standing stiff-backed by the door and Sarah perched on a stool, swinging her legs, clutching a fistful of dried wildflowers someone had saved from the bouquet that never made it down the aisle the day before. There was no crowd, no church bells, no audience but the 4 of them and the pale winter light falling through old glass. Della said her vows without her voice shaking. Eli said his with his bandaged arm resting steady at his side, his eyes never leaving her face. When it came time for the ring, the same one that had spent the last full day wrapped in a handkerchief in her coat pocket, carried through mud and storm and fear and back again, Della held out her hand without hesitation and did not flinch when he slid it into place. Sarah clapped, delighted, the sound bright and small in the quiet room. And for the first time since Della had stepped off the train into a town she didn't yet understand, she felt something settle inside her that she hadn't known she was missing. Not certainty exactly, not the absence of fear, but the sense of standing somewhere she was allowed, finally, to stay. They rode out to the ranch together that afternoon. The 3 of them, past fields turned silver-white with the season's first real snow. The barn's north side still stood open to the sky where the fire had taken the roof, black timber stark against the clean snow, a scar the winter would have to mend around. But the house beyond it stood warm and waiting, smoke already curling from the chimney where a hand had banked the fire that morning in quiet hope that someone would be coming home to it. Sarah ran ahead through the snow the moment the wagon stopped, her small boots leaving a scattered trail of prints toward the porch, laughing at nothing in particular, simply glad to be young and warm and home. Della stood beside Eli in the fading afternoon light and watched her go. Then, without a word between them, they followed, two sets of adult footprints falling in a step beside the smaller, uneven ones already leading toward the door, all three trails meeting at last on the porch steps, where a single lantern still burned faintly in the window, left lit through the whole long night by someone who had never stopped believing they'd find their way home.